If you were following an election campaign 20 years ago, you would have had the newspaper to read in the morning, the radio to listen to during the day, and if you wanted to actually see what the Prime Minister and the opposition leader had been up to, you'd have to wait for the 6 o'clock evening news. These days, if you're not watching Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott live, you can certainly see pictures as soon afterwards as you like. And forget waiting for the next day's paper for analysis. Most keen observers are straight onto Twitter and media websites for instant news and views. One man who follows the changing media landscape very closely is Rosen, a press critic, writer and professor of journalism at New York University. He's currently in Australia and indeed is with me in our Sydney studio. Welcome.
Thank you.
You've only landed in the country 24 hours ago. You've landed in the midst of an election, in case you haven't noticed.
I noticed.
You wrote in 2008, or you wrote of the 2008 US election that it was horse race journalism that works for journalists but doesn't work for the public. It fails for the public. Explain to us, what is horse race journalism, and is it something that's peculiar to the US, or do you see it in evidence here too?
Well, horse race journalism is sort of a reusable model for how to do campaign coverage, in which you focus on who's going to win rather than what the country needs to settle by electing a prime minister. And it's easy to do because you can kind of reuse it sort of like a Christmas tree every year, and it requires almost no knowledge either. And it kind of imagines the campaign as a sporting event, right? And everything that happens in the campaign can potentially affect the outcome. And so you can look at it as, how is it going to affect the horse race? And every day you can ask, who's ahead? And what is their strategy? And I think this perspective appeals to political reporters because it kind of puts them on the inside, you know, looking at the campaign the way the operatives do. By the way, I'm told that you actually have a program here on Sunday morning called The Insiders.
We do.
Is that true?
We do.
And the insiders are the journalists?
That is right.
That's remarkable.
The nature of, basically what you've just described there is basically what the day-to-day reporting of modern campaigns. What would be an alternative model then for reporting, like we just saw on the news, the cut and thrust of what the leaders are up to all day?
Well, an alternative model might start with, what do the people of Australia want this campaign to be about? What are the issues they want to see the candidates discussing? And then to ask each day, well, how did we do in advancing the discussion of the citizens' agenda today? Was it ignored? Was it addressed? Was it demagogued? Was it slighted? And if the journalists helped citizens get their agenda addressed during the campaign, they would be performing something that's actually very important, a role that's very important for them to do. But instead, if they want to simply become the chroniclers of the inside game and tell us from the point of view sort of the professional strategist who's doing better, well, they're going to, in a way, join the political class. And that's the attraction of the horse race.
But do you not need both? Because, of course, you do need the stories that give context and explain what's going on, and is this true, is this not true, how does this all fit? But then how do you ignore, say, for example, today when we have a former opposition leader showing up at a particular event, you can't very well just ignore that.
No, you can't. But what you could do is say, well, politics is also theater. Politics is entertainment. So in that segment of our coverage, we'll cover Latham. Is that his name? Latham. We'll cover Latham because clearly this is the entertainment portion of the campaign.
Presumably it's getting harder and harder to do contextual reporting because of the nature of news, the constant deadlines, the need to be sending back stuff online. So this type of reporting you're talking about is perhaps the only thing that is doable under some of these constraints.
Maybe, but even then you can send those who are interested in knowing more to the web to find out more. You can try and engage people in things that maybe don't strike them immediately as interesting, but underneath that are. And if you start with, what do the people of Australia want their candidates to be discussing, that's real also. And you can sort of press that and try to bring those things into the campaign. That would give journalists an agenda that's not an ideological thing, but is a very important role for them. Much more important, frankly, than telling us who's ahead today.
You mentioned reporting on things that might seem boring superficially, but are actually interesting when you dig a little bit deeper. And you've written about an example of some reporting in the United States to do with the financial crisis. Talk us through that a little.
Well, This American Life, which is one of our best radio programs, produced a 1-hour documentary in 2008 called The Giant Pool of Money, which explained the financial crisis and its roots in the mortgage market to people who, like me, didn't understand the story and thought it was kind of crazy. And they did it not by asking professors of finance to explain what went wrong in the market, but instead by going to people at every level of the system who were involved in this crazy system and asking them, what the heck did you think you were doing? And why? And getting them to explain their own actions in retrospect. And they started out, that is, the producers of the program, in the same position as members of the audience, baffled by this complicated thing that had crashed and caused huge, horrific consequences in their world. And they didn't understand it any better than the audience did. So they were representing the ignorance of the audience, and the drama of the documentary is they move from a position of ignorance to mastery of the subject by investigating it and starting where citizens start.
And so as a listener to that, did you feel at the end of it like you understood the origins of what was going on?
Well, that was the extraordinary thing. Before that time, I had heard about the subprime mortgage crisis, and I knew it was kind of serious, and headlines had warned me that this was big, but I didn't really understand a thing about it. And after I listened to this documentary, I knew what had happened. And I kind of knew why it had happened. And I also knew why it was important. And I knew how the events of mortgage brokers in Kansas were related to global finance, because they started with this giant pool of money that investors have around the world, and they search for opportunities to invest it to get a higher return. So that's where they began. So it connected the local to the global and explained this story, so that now I became a kind of customer for the news and for the remaining chapters of the story, which were still unfolding, like how do we prevent this?
The incremental stories then after that held your interest.
Yes, whereas before that the incremental stories not only didn't hold my interest, but in a way turned me off to the news.
There's a whole lot of stories like that around, that there never seems to be a beginning or an end. Say, for example, the Middle East crisis, where
Indeed.
It's a very difficult story to dip in and out of.
Yes, yes. But if we can't rely on our professional journalists to make the important interesting, whose job is it?
Where are most consumers getting their news from these days?
Well, it's lots of places. I mean, they certainly do get it from the traditional networks and newspapers. They also get it from each other, and they get it from amateurs as well as pros. And increasingly, because people are connected online all day long, they kind of get it from being awake. You know, like in a small town, you get your news by walking around. Right? Today, people get their news by just being online.
How significant is it getting news and links passed on to you from friends? How much, or people that you trust who have a presence, say, on something like Twitter, how important is that becoming, and how are mainstream news organisations dealing with that?
Well, in the days of big media, the audience was connected up to the ABC or to the Sydney Morning Herald, but not connected across to one another. And what's so different about the internet is that it's both. It still can connect you up. You can go right to the election campaign, or in the U.S., you can go right to whitehouse.gov and access the White House directly. But the internet is extremely effective at connecting friend to friend, daughter to father, right, peer to peer. And as a result, people get news as much horizontally by recommendations as they do from big media. So, for example, when Barack Obama gave his famous speech on race in 2008, which was a key moment in the campaign, it was on CNN during the day, but more people actually accessed it through the web afterwards, through